He had everything: private jets, designer suits, a last name worth billions. But when his grades collapsed and his father cut him off, the only person left to teach him wasn't a professor, wasn't a tutor, it was the school janitor. And what she told him would change his life forever. He had the kind of life most kids could only imagine. The kind of life that looked like a glossy magazine cover. In the parking lot of one of Atlanta's most elite private schools, a brand new Audi gleamed under the morning sun, its engine purring like it belonged more at a car show than in a faculty lot. The door swung open and out stepped Lucas Reed, 17 years old, draped in a tailored vest that cost more than some teachers made in a month. He didn't walk into school. He paraded. Shoulders back, chin tilted just enough to let the world know he owned every square inch of marble beneath his shoes. Students glanced his way, some with envy, others with open disgust. He loved it, or at least that's what he told himself. The hallways reflected light off the polished floors, portraits of powerful alumni staring down from gilded frames. Lucas barely noticed. To him, this wasn't school, it was a runway, and he was the headliner. In his hand, a folded test paper, red ink bleeding across the page in angry letters. An F, just another one. He stopped by the trash can at the center of the hall, unfolded the paper slowly like it was a winning lottery ticket, and with a smirk tossed it in. The sound of paper hitting plastic echoed, louder than it should have, and a few kids gasped. Lucas turned, spreading his arms as if to say, "What? Do you really think this matters?" They didn't answer. They didn't have to. A pair of sophomores down the hall had their phones out, recording, muffling their laughter. They'd post it later, and the video would spread like wildfire. The billionaire's son failing again. The joke everyone knew but no one dared say to his face. Lucas never saw it. He never noticed how their eyes didn't hold admiration but pity, mockery. All he saw was himself, the center of a universe he thought revolved around his last name. He leaned against the locker, checking the time on his designer watch, as if he had a meeting to attend instead of calculus. A teacher walked by, saw the test grade peeking out of the trash, and sighed quietly. But she didn't say a word. No one ever did. Everyone knew who his father was. Everyone knew the Reed donation kept the lights on. So they looked away, and Lucas took that silence as power. He mistook fear for respect. He mistook avoidance for awe. And so he carried himself higher, louder, more untouchable. But inside, when the noise of the hallways faded, when the laughter and whispers slipped away, there was nothing. No spark of pride, no sense of purpose. Just an empty boy in expensive clothes, hiding behind a name. The truth was brutal, but he couldn't see it yet. He thought he was untouchable, parading through life like a king without a crown. But the crown wasn't real. And every step he took, every smirk he threw, every paper he tossed into the trash, it wasn't victory. It was a countdown. What Lucas didn't know, what no one dared tell him, was that while he believed he was walking above them all, the world was laughing beneath its breath. The heir to a billion-dollar empire, stumbling through school with nothing but arrogance in his pockets, already becoming a punchline. The Reed estate sat on the edge of the city like a fortress of glass and steel. Its walls stretched high, polished so clean they reflected the fading sun like mirrors. Inside, silence filled the cavernous living room, broken only by the soft hum of air conditioning. No warmth, no family portraits, no laughter, just expensive art that felt as cold as the floor beneath it. Lucas dropped his bag by the door and slouched into a leather chair, pulling out his phone like nothing mattered. But Charles Reed was already there, standing in front of the tall windows, hands clasped behind his back, his reflection sharp against the skyline. He turned slowly, a folder in his hand. The air tightened. "Do you know what this is?" His voice was low, steady, cutting. Lucas didn't even look up. "Another lecture?" Charles opened the folder and let the pages fall onto the glass table between them. Grades, F after F, lined up like a graveyard of missed chances. "This is your record. This is who you are becoming." Lucas smirked, leaning back. "And I'll be fine, last name Reed, remember?" He thought it was clever, untouchable, but Charles didn't laugh. He stepped closer, eyes like stone. "Do you think the world cares about your last name? Do you think money will carry you when you stand with nothing else to offer?" Lucas shrugged, rolling his eyes, but his fingers gripped the arm of the chair a little tighter. Charles reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim card. Lucas's credit card. He snapped it clean in half, the sound echoing through the room. "No more," Charles said. "No cars, no cards, no special treatment. Tomorrow you take the bus like every other student." Lucas sat forward, disbelief flashing across his face. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Charles answered. He walked past the boy, picked up the car keys from the table and slipped them into his pocket. The Audi was gone, the allowance gone, the safety net cut clean. For the first time, Lucas felt the ground shift beneath him. He stood quickly, voice rising. "You can't do this. I'm your son, not your employee." Charles turned, his face unreadable. His words came cold and precise, each one a blade. "If my company had a son like you, I'd shut it down." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Lucas's mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing. For once, his arrogance couldn't shield him. He stormed off, footsteps pounding against marble, slamming the door to his room. In the dark, the city lights flickered through the glass walls, painting him in fractured shadows. He sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders tense, jaw locked, staring at his reflection in the black screen of his phone. For the first time, he wasn't laughing. The mansion had never felt bigger, emptier, and Lucas Reed, the boy who thought he couldn't be touched, felt something unfamiliar crawling under his skin. Not fear exactly, but the beginning of it. The rain came down heavy that morning, a gray curtain over the city. For the first time in his life, Lucas Reed stood at the curb waiting for the school bus. No Audi, no driver, just wet shoes and a crowd of students who couldn't believe what they were seeing. He climbed the steps awkwardly, brushing raindrops from his designer jacket. Conversations hushed, faces turned. A boy in the back whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Guess Daddy cut him off." Laughter rippled through the rows. Lucas clenched his jaw, slid into an empty seat, and stared out the window as if the storm outside was more interesting than the storm inside his chest. When the bus screeched to a halt in front of the marble-pillared school, Lucas hurried off, pulling his hood over his head, hoping no one would notice the flush on his cheeks. But of course, they did. The hallways felt colder than usual, the polished floor reflecting the overhead lights like ice. Students scattered to classes, sneakers squeaking against the tiles, chatter buzzing like static. Lucas kept his head down, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He wasn't strutting anymore. He was moving quickly, almost small, almost invisible. That's when he heard it. A voice low, steady, almost like a hum rising above the sound of lockers slamming and footsteps rushing by. "The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing." Lucas stopped mid-step, head turning toward the sound. By the side entrance, an older woman in a faded janitor's uniform was mopping the floor. Her back was straight, her motions slow but precise. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just spoke the words as though they weren't meant for the world, just for herself. Lucas frowned. "What did you just say?" His voice was sharp, defensive, the kind of tone he used when he felt caught off guard. The woman raised her head calmly, her dark eyes steady, unshaken by his tone. "Nothing you're ready to understand, boy." Then she went back to work, pushing the mop in quiet, deliberate strokes. Lucas blinked. "Wait, what does that mean?" But she didn't answer. She didn't even look at him again. Just turned, bucket wheels squeaking, and walked down the hall until the sound of her footsteps disappeared. Lucas stood frozen for a moment, the words looping in his head. "Knowing you know nothing." It was ridiculous. It was strange. It was unsettling. He shook his head, forcing a laugh under his breath, but the sting was real. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. Not his teachers, not his classmates, not even his father. They either feared him or mocked him. But this woman, this janitor, she cut right through him as if she could see past the expensive clothes and the famous name, as if she knew something he didn't. The bell rang, jolting him back. Lucas turned and walked quickly down the hall, but the smirk he tried to wear felt heavy, forced. He could feel the laughter behind him, the whispers that used to slide off his back now crawling under his skin. And yet, through all the noise, it wasn't their voices that stayed with him. It was hers, quiet, firm, certain. "The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing." He repeated it in his head like a riddle he couldn't solve, each word pressing deeper than he wanted to admit. For the first time, Lucas Reed felt the glass wall around him crack, just slightly, as if someone had reached through and touched the part of him he thought no one could ever see. The school was still asleep when Lucas arrived the next morning. A pale fog clung to the edges of the building, wrapping the courtyard in silence. He pushed open the side door, footsteps echoing down the empty hall. The polished floor caught the flicker of a yellow light above, and there she was. Evelyn, mop in hand, moving with the same slow precision as yesterday, her posture upright, her face calm. For a moment, Lucas just stood there, hands stuffed in his pockets, unsure of what to say. Then the words tumbled out, sharper than he intended. "Teach me." She paused mid-stroke, eyes lifting to meet his. They were steady, dark, unreadable. "Teach you what?" she asked. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, something, anything. I can't keep failing like this." He hated how desperate it sounded, how small. Evelyn leaned on the handle of her mop, studying him. "One condition," she said. "You leave your name at the door. No Reed, no money, no arrogance. You start from zero, from the floor." Lucas frowned, biting his cheek. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that, not even his father. He wanted to argue, to throw her words back, but instead he muttered, "Fine, I can't keep being this." Evelyn nodded once, slow, deliberate, then motioned to a bench against the wall. "Sit." Lucas dropped onto the bench, pulling a crumpled notebook from his bag. Evelyn handed him a small paperback. Its cover worn, its pages creased from years of use. "Read," she said simply. Lucas opened it, scanning the first passage. The words swam in front of his eyes. He read aloud, stumbling over sentences, flat and lifeless. Evelyn stopped him. "Don't just read, tell me what it means." Lucas blinked. "What do you mean, what it means? It's just words." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "That's the problem. You see letters, I see life. What is the author trying to say?" Lucas stared at the page, frustrated. "I don't know." Evelyn didn't flinch. "Then say that. That's the beginning, admitting you don't know." Lucas slammed the book shut, heat rising in his chest. "This is stupid." He stood quickly, shoving the notebook into his bag. "Forget it. I'm done." He stormed out, footsteps pounding against the tile, the echo chasing him down the hall. Evelyn didn't call after him. She didn't plead. She just turned back to her mop, moving in slow circles as if nothing had changed. That night, Lucas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words gnawing at him. "You leave your name at the door. Start from zero. Admit you don't know." It was humiliating. It was infuriating. And yet it was true. For the first time, the walls of arrogance he'd built felt brittle. He remembered her eyes, calm but unyielding, and the way she didn't bend to his tantrum. No one had ever done that before. The next evening, long after the halls had emptied, Lucas returned. He found her near the east wing, polishing the floor in silence. She didn't look surprised to see him. He stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, clutching the notebook like it might slip away. "I shouldn't have walked out," he muttered. Evelyn finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "So why are you back?" "Because I can't do this alone," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a battered notebook, edges frayed. She handed it to him. "Every morning before class, you meet me here. 1 hour. Every evening after I finish cleaning. You write not what you think I want to hear, not what your teachers want. Write what you feel, what you understand, what confuses you. No grades, just truth." Lucas opened the notebook. The pages were blank, waiting. It felt heavy in his hands, like a weight and a promise. "What if I fail again?" he asked. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Then you're finally doing it right." Lucas swallowed hard, nodding. He sat back down, opened the book she'd given him earlier, and tried again. His voice shook, his mind stumbled, but he stayed. For the first time in his life, Lucas Reed left his last name at the door. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover who he really was. And the janitor he thought invisible was about to reveal she wasn't just a woman with a mop. She was once a professor, a teacher who knew how to rebuild broken minds from the ground up. The office of Charles Reed was a world of glass and numbers. Floor-ceiling windows overlooked the city, walls lined with digital charts that pulsed red and green like a heartbeat of money. Lucas stepped in, clutching a folder to his chest. Inside was his latest essay, marked with rare praise from a teacher who once wrote him off. For the first time, he felt like he had something real to show. Charles didn't look up. He was on a call, discussing acquisitions, his tone sharp, efficient, lethal. When he finally hung up, he glanced at his son as if already impatient. "What is it this time?" Lucas slid the folder across the desk, trying to keep his voice steady. "I wrote this. My teacher said it was good." Charles opened it without ceremony, eyes scanning quickly, his brow furrowed. The words weren't shallow. They carried weight, reflection, thought. It was nothing like the careless work Lucas had turned in before, but something else caught his attention. Scribbles in the margins, notes in a handwriting that wasn't his son's. Charles closed the folder slowly. "Where did you get this?" Lucas hesitated, then answered, "Evelyn helped me. The janitor." The word hung in the sterile air like a stain. Charles leaned back in his chair, disbelief curving into a laugh that was sharp and cold. "A janitor? That's who you're learning from now." Lucas straightened, defensive. "She's more than that. She was a professor. She taught me more in weeks than anyone else has in years." Charles cut him off, voice low, dripping with contempt. "She mops floors. That's all that matters. That's what she is." Lucas's chest tightened, but the anger pushed through. "She mopped floors, yes. But she also mopped the arrogance out of me, something you never could." For a split second, the words shocked even him. They burned in the air, daring his father to respond. Charles's jaw tightened, the mask of composure cracking just enough to show the fury beneath. "Do you have any idea how pathetic you sound? You're embarrassing this family. You're wasting time with people who have nothing to offer." "She sees me," Lucas snapped, his voice rising. "You never did." The silence after was heavy, sharp enough to cut. Charles stood, walking around the desk until he was face to face with his son. His voice dropped into a whisper, but the venom made it louder than a shout. "Stop this nonsense now. If you keep going down this road, you lose everything. No car, no money, no name, don't test me." Lucas's throat tightened, but he refused to look away. For the first time, he wasn't the boy cowering under the weight of his father's empire. He was standing, trembling but unbroken, staring back at the man who thought control was love. Charles stepped back, his decision final, his eyes cold as the glass walls surrounding them. The line had been drawn. Lucas left the office gripping the folder tighter than before, heart pounding with fear and fury. For the first time, he realized what the fight would cost, and for the first time, he was ready to pay it. The halls were quieter than usual that afternoon, shadows stretching long across the tiled floor. A rainstorm had just passed, leaving the windows streaked, the air heavy. Outside, a security vehicle idled by the gate, its lights flashing silently, a signal that something was wrong. Lucas felt it before he knew it. A strange pull in his chest, the kind that warns you before the words ever reach your ears. He turned the corner and saw Evelyn walking down the hall. Not with her mop, not with her bucket, but with a cardboard box cradled in her arms. Her uniform was the same, wrinkled, simple, but her steps were slower, heavier. Two administrators walked a few paces behind, their eyes down, their mouths tight. They didn't look at her and she didn't look at them. Lucas froze. "Evelyn," his voice cracked louder than he meant, but she didn't turn. She just kept walking, steady, silent. The box shifted in her grip. The edges frayed with papers, a pair of old books, a small picture frame. That was all. That was her life here. A job ended with a quiet escort. Lucas darted forward, heart racing. "What's happening? Where are you going?" One of the administrators blocked his path. "It's done. Budget cuts. That's all you need to know." Lucas shoved past, desperate, but by the time he reached the door, Evelyn was already stepping outside. The security car door opened. She climbed in without looking back. The gate swung closed behind her, gone just like that. Lucas stood in the rain, chest hollow, watching taillights fade into the blur of water and asphalt. He turned back inside, feet moving on instinct. He searched the halls, the cafeteria, the library, empty, no trace of her voice, her calm, her steady presence, until he reached the east wing. There, leaning against the wall, sat her old mop bucket, abandoned. The handle tilted awkwardly, a damp rag still clinging to the side. Lucas sank to his knees beside it, his hands gripping the cold metal. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The boy who thought he was untouchable, who thought nothing could shake him, now sat trembling in the silence of a hallway stripped of its only light. The arrogance that once shielded him was gone. The anger that once fueled him was gone. All that remained was a crushing emptiness. Students passed by, whispering. Some laughed. Some stared, but Lucas didn't hear them. He pressed his forehead against the edge of the bucket, whispering her name as if it could bring her back. It didn't. That night, the school bulletin board lit up with a new announcement. End-of-year speech contest. Theme, what it means to win in life. Students crowded around to read it, buzzing with excitement about scholarships, recommendations, college scouts. Lucas stood at the back, rainwater still dripping from his hair, staring at the paper. His heart twisted. Winning. He thought about the essays Evelyn made him rewrite until they bled honesty. He thought about her voice telling him learning was transformation. He thought about how she was ripped away not because she failed, but because she worked too well, too honestly. Lucas clenched his fists, the sting of her absence burning deeper with each breath. The contest wasn't just an assignment anymore. It was a battlefield, and he knew somehow that this was the only chance left to speak the truth she gave him, the only way to keep her voice alive. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, the air buzzing with nervous whispers and the shuffle of programs. Parents in tailored suits and polished heels lined the aisles, teachers stood stiffly near the walls, and students fidgeted in their seats, waiting for their names to be called. The stage was draped in velvet curtains, spotlights fixed and ready. At the side of the stage, Lucas stood alone, clutching a worn notebook. His palms were damp, his throat dry, his heart beating so loud he swore the microphone might pick it up. He wore no flashy blazer, no designer shoes, just a plain navy shirt and dark jeans. For the first time in his life, he wasn't dressed to impress. He was dressed to tell the truth. His name was called. The room hushed as he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinding, the silence heavy. Lucas Reed, the boy who had failed every test, who had been laughed at, who had lived behind a last name. All of them were waiting to see if he would stumble again. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white, then opened the notebook in his hand. The handwriting inside wasn't all his. margins filled with red ink, sharp corrections, and the voice of someone who had once stood beside him. He took a deep breath and began. "My name is Lucas Reed. Some of you know me as the kid who wasted a golden ticket, who didn't care, who failed. They say I had everything, but I didn't. I didn't have the one thing that mattered, someone who believed in me until she showed up." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "She wasn't hired to teach me. She wasn't paid to believe in me, but she did. That's why I stand here not as a Reed, but as myself." The room froze. No coughs, no whispers, no shifting feet. Just silence, thick and unbroken. Lucas's eyes scanned the crowd, landing on rows of skeptical faces, furrowed brows, jaws tight with disbelief. He swallowed and kept going. "She taught me how to read between the lines in books and in life. She taught me how to write, how to think, how to listen. She didn't just clean the floors of this school, she cleared the fog in my head." His words hit the room like a stone in still water. Ripples moved through the audience, parents leaning forward, teachers exchanging glances. He lifted the notebook higher. "She told me learning was transformation. That real winning isn't about being rich or powerful. It's about becoming someone worth remembering." His voice softened, steady now, every word striking with precision. "She isn't here right now, at least not on this stage. But she's in every word I'm saying." Lucas paused, the silence stretching, unbearable and electric. Then a single clap broke it, one pair of hands from the back, then another, and then the sound spread like fire. The entire auditorium erupted, parents rising to their feet, students cheering, teachers with tears in their eyes. A standing ovation. Lucas exhaled, trembling, overwhelmed, gripping the podium for balance. And then he saw her. At the far end of the auditorium, half hidden by the shadows near the exit, Evelyn stood. No mop, no bucket, no uniform. Just herself in a simple headscarf, her eyes shining with tears. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out. She just watched, her lips pressed into the faintest smile as if to say, "You did it." Lucas's chest tightened. For a moment, the applause, the noise, the roaring approval, it all fell away. All he saw was her. The woman everyone ignored. The janitor who wasn't just a janitor. The teacher who had rebuilt him from the ground up. Lucas closed the notebook slowly and stepped back from the microphone. The ovation thundered, echoing through the hall, shaking the walls. But the real victory wasn't in the clapping or the tears or the standing crowd. It was in that quiet figure at the back of the room, the one who had given him her words when he had nothing else. She hadn't returned to take the spotlight. She had returned to see if he could carry it, and now he had. In that moment, Lucas Reed was no longer the boy with a last name. He was his own name, his own voice, and the world finally heard him. The building stood on a corner of the city most people forgot. Its bricks were faded, its windows scarred from years of neglect, the kind of place once written off as another shell in a neighborhood that had stopped expecting hope. But tonight, the lights were on. Children's voices echoed from inside, books clutched in their hands, pencils scratching across paper at long tables that had been polished and set straight. Above the doorway, a new sign gleamed in simple lettering. The Evelyn Institute. Inside, Lucas moved through the room with a quiet pride, helping a boy sound out words, kneeling beside a girl struggling with math, listening more than speaking. His clothes were plain, his tone patient, his eyes steady. He was no longer the arrogant heir who strutted through marble hallways. He was a teacher, a builder, someone whose worth came not from his name, but from what he gave. Evelyn sat at the front of the room, her posture as straight as ever. Her hands folded in her lap, watching the children with a look that carried years of pain and years of healing. When the ribbon was cut earlier that evening, applause filled the air, not from shareholders or board members, but from parents, neighbors, and children who knew this place might change their lives. Lucas had been offered Ivy League acceptance letters, golden doors wide open, but he turned them down. Instead, he chose this, a repurposed community center in the heart of the city. Because for him, the real victory was here, where kids who had been ignored were finally being seen. The ceremony wound down, the crowd thinning, and Lucas stepped outside to catch his breath. The night air was cool, the streetlights buzzing softly. That's when he saw him. Charles Reed stood near the back, away from the lights, hands in his pockets, watching. His sharp gray suit was the same, but something in his face wasn't. His eyes were softer, the lines around them deeper. He had said nothing during the ceremony, just stood silently as his son spoke about justice, humility, and transformation. Now, when the crowd had cleared, he approached. For a moment, father and son stood face to face, years of distance between them. Charles spoke first, his voice low, almost breaking. "I didn't expect to cry." Lucas let the words sink in. He thought of all the nights he sat alone in his room, wishing his father would see him. All the times he failed, all the times he shouted, all the silence that grew like walls between them. He took a slow breath. I didn't expect to forgive. The words cut through the night like a release. Charles's eyes lowered, then lifted again, raw and human in a way Lucas had never seen. They stepped closer, and for the first time they embraced, not as a billionaire and his heir, not as a cold father and a bitter son, but as two men who had broken and were trying, piece by piece, to rebuild. Inside, the children kept reading, their voices rising with new confidence. Evelyn watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening. The boy she once found drowning had become the man leading others to shore. The janitor who had once been invisible now had her name carved into the future of the city. Months passed, and the institute grew. Classes filled every room, from writing circles to science clubs. Murals painted by students brightened the walls, quotes lined the halls. If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. The function of freedom is to free someone else. The kind of wisdom Evelyn had once whispered in empty hallways now shouted proudly from every corner. Lucas never stopped learning. Each night he still opened a notebook, writing reflections, questions, fears. Evelyn still answered, not with solutions but with challenges. And together, they built a place where children weren't defined by grades or last names, but by the fire in their voices. The city noticed. Newspapers wrote headlines about the billionaire's son who chose chalk over power. Awards followed, invitations came, but Lucas always turned back to the children, to the simple promise that began it all. One evening, standing before a national audience, he said the words that had become his truth. They said, "I failed everything until I learned one secret. That greatness doesn't come from being seen. It comes from seeing others." And sometimes the person who teaches you the most isn't in a suit. They're holding a mop, whispering philosophy while no one's listening. Her name is Evelyn Wallace. She didn't just save my grades, she saved my life. The applause was thunderous, but Lucas's eyes sought only one face in the crowd. Evelyn, smiling quietly, the way she always had, as if to remind him that the work was never about glory. It was about light. And Lucas Reed, once a boy lost in arrogance, had become its keeper. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.